Welcome to another episode of Flutter Original. And this episode is a very special one. I have a very special, prolific author of many the tools that you're probably using in your Flutter or Dart applications. Remi Rousselet is with me today, and it's an honor to have you on this show, Remi. How are you today?
I'm fine. What about you?
I'm pretty good, thank you. I cannot be more excited. As finally, I got you to this show. I think a lot of people will been waiting for this moment. I promised to many devs that you will be on this show one day and talking about at least some of the things that you're doing. On let's say today, I want to talk about Riverpod mostly. But before that, Remy, a lot of people know you already, but introduce yourself for those who probably don't know you well.
Mm. Yeah, so I'm Remy. I'm an open source developer working on a bunch of packages like Riverpod, Freezed, Hooks 2. Usually trying to make your state management and related stuff a bit easier in Flutter. Um, yeah, and I'm working on Vertex too, where we're doing a bunch of open source. So if you're interested, um, yeah, that's about it.
That's cool. I think Remy, a little bit of his story. So you've been with Dart and Flutter from a very early stage, let's say, I guess. And um, I myself find you on Stack Overflow, where you've been very active and you answered so many questions, and some of them very in detail. How did you find Dart, and how did you decide like to start working with Dart at all? And then thinking even creating dev tools or like say developer tooling that is kind of solving some problems to make developer experience better. So how did you ended up doing such a thing?
Well, I used to be a web developer a while ago, and from a coworker, I heard about Dart because we had some issues at the company. We were looking for a way of making type code in web, and one of the things that was mentioned was Dart. So I looked up Dart, and somehow in the Dart web page, Flutter was mentioned. So I tried Flutter to try Dart. I didn't try it. My goal wasn't to try Flutter full Flutter. Just wanted to try Dart, and I fell in love with it, and so I stayed. And yeah, as for why I made all these dev tools, it's usually because first I liked answering on Stack Overflow because it helped me learn more about Flutter. Because at the time the community wasn't quite big, so it was a nice way of reaching out to people and learning more about Flutter. And at some point, I realized that some questions were coming back all the time. Um, and so even though I spent quite a lot of time answering those questions, they still kept popping up. And 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 so I started thinking about if I could solve the problem at the source so that people wouldn't have those anymore. And started making some packages. So that's how Provider came to be. And all these other packages are kind of like step ups. Like more problems were found and more solutions were made, and it keeps going. So that's where we are
That's
today.
very interesting. I mean, so I guess one of the first packages that you created was Provider, if I'm not mistaken. And so, well, do you want to talk about it a bit? And many people know these days you already created like a successor to Provider, or let's say Riverpod. So, how did you create that package? What kind of problem you solve, and why did you ended up rewriting that again into Riverpod?
um, when I made Provider, it was mostly to help solving a few issues related to inherited widgets. Because inherited widgets are a bit raw, I would say. Very confusing in a few different ways. One of which was when people use the inherited widgets, they typically always forgot to make a stateful widget associated with it to cache the changing behavior or whatever you're exposing. They like to use a stateless widget to and just create the model directly inside the build method. But if the widget reveals, somehow the state is destroyed, and people kept asking, "Why is my state destroyed?" And and so one of the solutions was making kind of what I called at the time a stateful provider, which is basically an inherited widget, um, which basically instead of taking a value, it takes a callback which returns a value and it caches that value. You can see that pattern basically everywhere if you're familiar with provider and Riverpod. Um, so now you don't have to make a stateful widget anymore. You just use the provider in your stateless widget, and the problem doesn't appear anymore. Um, so that was the first thing, the first reason. Then, I mean, once you're here, you can dispose the state for people. You can subscribe to it so that they don't forget about it. You can do a bunch of extra stuff. Yeah, there is a lot of problems. We can probably talk about it for like hours.
Hours. I understand. Yeah. I bet many like I can literally say maybe 100% of Flutter developers already know somehow provider. So this is the first kind of package that many developers are introduced to when they come to developing, Flutter applications. And part of it because it's a fantastic tool that you created our package, and part of it is because for a long time it was recommended by Google or Flutter team somehow, instead of using like the ordinary solution for, like as you said,
Yeah.
inherited widget. So, and but then you ended up rewriting that to Riverpod.
Yes.
So, and do you want to talk a little bit about Riverpod? What's the story and what's your take on it like right now?
Well, Riverpod is basically provider, hence the name. Riverpod is an anagram of provider. The main reason why we have two packages instead of one, it's because I wanted to make provider better, but the issue was that I faced a bunch of core uh, problems around Flutter, more specifically inherited widgets. The APIs have a few flaws, I would say. Um, like when you start when a widget starts subscribing to an inherited widget, it never stops unsubscribing to that inherited widget. So, for example, if you conditionally invoke team.auth inside your widget and the condition goes from true to false, then the widget will still rebuild when the theme changes, even though it doesn't use it anymore. One of the complex areas with inherited widget is related to scoping. Because with inherited widget, you can place your inherited widgets anywhere in the widget tree, including at lower levels. But it means that if you try to access inherited widget from higher levels, you won't get it. Which is fine, and it's an interesting pattern. But it involves so much complexity for this behavior, and most of the time, like 99% of the time, you don't need this at all. Um, you, Usually, you just have one instance that's available for the entire widget tree, and
Mhm.
um, I mean, this scoping mechanism is more. It, from my experience, the scoping mechanism is used more by people as a way of destroying the state when it's no longer needed, instead of uh, actually relying on not exposing a value to a subtree. Like this bit doesn't quite matter in my opinion. Um, so yeah, the main issue is that people were trying to destroy the state when they didn't use it anymore, but they used an underhanded way of doing it, um, which caused problems, made the application quite complex. So I wasn't satisfied with how provider solves this and a bunch of other things. Like I mentioned, there are many problems. Um, and looked for improvements to the variant. Like another problem, for example, that I was never satisfied in provider was the proxy provider. If you're aware of it, in my opinion, it's terrible design, but whatever. um, like combining providers in the provider package is very difficult. So that's another problem. So yeah, all these problems that built up over time. I searched for a while for solutions for those and came to what I believe is fairly decent solutions in the new Riverpod package. It offers basically a different way of solving those problems that is more um, tailored to what you would expect in Flutter. So instead of scoping a provider to destroyed state, for example, now you can flag it at what we call auto dispose in Riverpod. So
Yeah.
by doing that, the state will get destroyed if you stop using it. So this you have the same behavior of garbage collecting your state when it's no longer used, but it's not relying on scoping anymore. It's relying on slightly different behavior. So the effect is the same, but the complexity isn't. Um, but basically, it's this sort of things, different approach to solve the same problems.
And definitely, I mean, to my opinion, so these are all great things that we've been missing. As a person that who've been working with provider for a long time, definitely was kind of missing. Always solvable, but now coming that to Riverpod, it just makes it super easy. But there is one argument though here, which I think that will be my last question, and we get to pair programming afterwards. Um, so a lot of people say that a Riverpod, you say it's provider, but many people argue that provider it was super simple to use, whereas a provider it's not. Although I usually let me say my answer to this, because a lot of people say this without really spending maybe a few minutes on the documentation. The reason is like, well, the first thing you see that the provider in Riverpod, let's say, that's technically provider. I mean, so without even changing anything, people can see that. Of course, it comes with more complexity and more tools. But how do you answer this question? How do you usually get back to people if they ask
Mm.
such a things?
Yeah, in my opinion, it's a tricky issue because there are a few problems involved. In my opinion, first, the documentation of providers is ironically bad, in the sense that it doesn't cover a lot of stuff, whereas Riverpod tries to go in depth on those topics. But it probably confused people because somehow Riverpod has this bunch of pages of documentations, whereas Riverpod providers like barely a README, and so one of those looks simpler than the other by default, ironically. Um, and also, like the discussions around provider are usually very focused on change notifier providers that barely discuss about anything else. Whereas any article about Drupal somehow tries to list every single possibilities, even though you could technically still use just change notifier provider if you wanted
Yeah.
to. Uh, like technically, basically everything you have in Drupal, you have the same thing in provider, but just people don't know about those. Like they don't know you can use state notifier provider in provider too. Or there is stream provider there too, feature provider. Um, just people don't know about it. Um, in fact, there are probably more kind of providers in the provider package than in Riverpod, which says. um, so yeah, in general, I would say, in my opinion, Riverpod is um, probably simpler in the sense that if you use it, you will have fewer problems. So it's simpler in that sense. Like the code will work better, but it's probably a bit less intuitive at first because you're likely used to a different way of doing things. So yeah,
Yeah.
um, there is a word for it, like shared knowledge. I'm not sure. Like when you
Yeah.
do something, so when you go to a new area, you already have
You kind of shift your way of writing
yeah.
code as well, like, so
It's a bit of a different paradigm, which is what
paradigm. Yeah.
is a bit of some people. Um, so that's probably part of why people think it's more complex, because you have to learn a slightly different approach. So of course people are a bit disturbed by it. Um,
Yeah.
so
It
yeah, that's
sounds
maybe
good, Remy. I mean, this is good. So nothing is beating a pair programming with the author of Riverpod at this point. So I think the best is now let's share your VS Code and let's get into Riverpod and see. I really want to show people how author of package or the author of Riverpod is using Riverpod in an application. See, it's gonna be funny, I believe. So let's get it started, Remy. Then, if let's say now you have an application, you're sharing your code right now.
yeah.
How do you start using Riverpod?
Using Riverpod. Well, the first thing you need to do when you want to use Riverpod, the very first thing is in your main, you'll have to add something called provider's code in your application here. First, you'll need, of course, to import Riverpod. So Jira, you have a few options. Um,
So, do you recommend? Okay, that's one of the question right now. Then, so I
yeah.
see that you're using
Mhm.
hooks, and also, so is this something that you will really start working with Riverpod? Like hooks
Um,
is one of your
I like using
recommend.
hooks. I can understand why some people don't like those, which is why it's optional. It's voluntarily optional for those who don't like it. Um, in my opinion, it's nice, especially if you want to do something like full metal. But if you're getting started with Riverpod, you don't necessarily have to think about it. Like, don't necessarily start with it. Just start with for Riverpod. It's fine. Basically the same thing. You can look into hooks later once you're more familiar with Riverpod and maybe Flutter. And I'm just using it because that's my default. But I'm
Okay.
pretty used to it.
Yeah, that's actually that's what we want to see. We want to see what's your default as the author of package. Very
Yeah.
nice. So then hooks is your default. That's
That's
nice.
also why there is a new documentation website in progress where there are a bunch of toggles enabled. In the documentation, it has on the top right of the site a bunch of toggles about what you want to enable. Like, do you want to enable hooks? Do you want to enable code generation? And it represents what I think is a good default for beginners. So by default, hooks are disabled, but code generation is enabled. Uh, my stance on configuration is that sure, you have to run an extra command, you have to run build runner, but I mean, you can start it once in background in watch mode and forget about it. So sure, as the first thing of your day is it takes maybe a minute, and you can grab a cup of coffee, and then you'll be fine for the rest of the day. But then after that point, the benefits of code generation are quite big. Like they allow significant simplifications of your program. Um, they can remove a lot of potential errors when programming, which is why I use it and why I recommend it. Um, so yeah, and especially considering in the future we're likely going to have what's called static metaprogramming, which is called code generation for Dart directly built in the language, so you wouldn't have to run this build runner watch command anymore. Uh, the code generation would basically work automatically without you thinking about it. So at this point, the downside of code generation would basically be none, uh, but you would have all the upsides. So if you stopped using it now, you probably would have a smoother path to upgrade once static metaprogramming is available.
Interesting. Okay, that's very nice to hear about this. So then provider actually comes with code generation. So for some people it might be a new things because
Mm.
it
What's a
was
bit
not really
exceptional? Like I mentioned, generally, is there something a bit controversial? I try to offer both paths, both solutions. Um, so if you really don't want to use code generation, you can do entirely without it. Especially once you think about it, Riverpod was originally without code generation at all. It's a fairly recent thing. Uh, so yeah, but if you're new to it, and if you're not sure, just start with code generation. It's probably going to make your life easier.
Interesting. Do you wanna show us quickly, like for code generation in Riverpod, what packages we need to install?
Yes. Is it not here? Oh, yeah. Placed it in different place. So you basically need to do a few things. So first you need to install a Riverbot. So either your hooks Riverbot, your Flutter Riverbot, whatever.
Yeah.
And then the annotation package, both in the dependencies part, and then inside dev dependencies, you'll install build runner, which is used to start the code generation, and Riverpod generator, which is the actual code generation implementation. And then if you're using code generation, you might as well install Phrased and maybe JSON serializable, which are typically used to get with Riverpod too.
Yeah. So for those who probably don't know, Freeze is also one of the packages that Remy has created. So we're gonna have another show about Freeze later. So let's focus on Riverpod at this point. Okay, so then we have provider scope wrapping our entire app into, let's say, provider scope. What next?
Um, at this point, you're basically set up to start using Riverpod in your application. So you can start defining what we call providers and use them. So let's first, for example, define a provider. Well, if we're going to use conjunction, there is an extra step first. In your dart files, when you want to use conjunction, you have to specify the bar directive, which is
Yeah.
basically your file name with .g.dart. So here I'm in the main.dart, so I specify main.g.dart, which is the file that's going to be generated. Here obviously doesn't exist yet. And so if I'm going to use Riverpod, the generator, I need to import Riverpod annotation. And so now I can define a provider. A provider is defined with the Riverpod annotation, and then you can define a plain function like in count or hello world, or stuff with an hello world. And hello world. So providers generally when you annotate a function with at Riverpod, it has to take one parameter, which is basically the function name with ref after it, and
It's like a convention, right? So
yes,
yeah,
and the parameter is typically named ref,
yeah.
which is a class which will be generated. So if I save now, the generator will run, and
Though
hopefully,
there probably should be some kind of error because you're returning
oh, I
integer.
see. It's because I changed the box spec, so the generator stopped. Oh yeah, and
That should return in string.
it's should restart now. Okay. Should be good now. Yeah, so now I define a provider. And if I want to use it inside widgets, one of the things you can do here, where are we? Like if I wanted to show it here, or maybe here, replace the counter with the hello world level,
Yeah,
we could use a widget called consumer, which is basically kind of like your string builder, feature builder, the builder pattern in Flutter. Which takes two two parameters, or three, I forgot. So the context, a ref object, which we'll talk about later, and the last parameter is an optional parameter, optional child parameter. Not very important right now for performance optimization. And so here, if we want to show the hello level, what we can do is using this ref object we have here, we can use it to read providers. So to do that, um, You see the auto completion, like Copilot is already doing it for me.
Yeah.
Um, um, I can call ref.watch and pass the provider we defined before. Provider, you see hello world provider here. Hello world provider is because um, we define a function named hello world, and so Riverpod takes this name, takes the hello world and adds provider, which is a new variable generated. As you can see here, if I go to the definition,
Yeah.
you can see it, which invokes our hello world function and goes
I
back.
mean, in fact, if you want to define it without code generation, you need to do that yourself.
If you want to do it without code generation, it would likely look something like that. Yeah, you see, once again, it's
Yeah.
auto completion does it for me. It looks basically this way without code generation. Yes, I'll remove it, but yeah. Okay, so I obtained the provider, so now I have the content of the provider, and I can just show it here.
So one question that I get from time to time, I'd like to hear the answer from you is, so we're actually getting a reference with watch to a provider in a build method. So where build is running many times, right? So is that safe? Or how does that work? Should we always use watch or there's other way to do it as well?
Um, there are there are a few methods on here. But generally, basically the rule is if you're in the build method, you need to use watch.
Yeah.
Uh, I've seen many people ask, "Yeah, I'm in the build method, but the value won't update, or I want to optimize things, and I want to use what's called ref.read instead to not rebuild the widget when the value changes." But that's considered a bad practice. You should always use watch if you're within the build method. Don't use
Okay.
if you're within a builder too. Don't use read here. If you're going to use implementation, if you're looking after performance optimization, um, you can use something. You can instead do something like ref.watch.select. Select is used in the scenario where you have a provider which emits an object which contains multiple properties, and you want to listen to only one
Yeah.
of the properties. Like if somehow instead of the entire hello world text, I just wanted to show the length. There is no need for the widget to rebuild if the length didn't change. Like maybe it went
Yeah.
from hello world to another string of the same length. In that case,
It
we don't
does.
care about the
Yeah.
update. Um, So if you want to do this optimization, you could do select and only obtain here the value would pass to the callback would be the hello world string, and you can return just the length. And so
Yeah.
here you wouldn't get the string anymore. You would get directly the length here, and you can pass it here. Well, this string, of course, but this string. And now the widget will rebuild only once the length changes instead of whenever this string changes.
Okay.
So that's a way of still using watch, but doing the performance optimization. If you want to look into the other ways of listening to things, um, like if you want to use read, the only case where you would use read would be inside things like onPressed, where
Hmm.
here you can do a ref.read. Well, you need a ref, but you read the ID provider. You can do that here because in the on-press, you don't want your widget to listen to the provider anymore. It doesn't make sense here. You don't have
Yeah.
UI associated. Um, yeah, so that's particularly the rule. In fact, there is an upcoming lint rule for this, which I haven't
Nice.
announced yet, but I mean, I can talk about it. Which would basically tell you at any given point which method you should use. So it's not
Nice.
really that you have the choice and you need to decide which one to pick. Is that there is only one choice, and the choice changes based on your context.
I see.
Depending on where you are, there is always basically one solution.
Okay. So it's like very less likely than you make mistake here in this
Yes,
case with
exactly.
this.
The linker
Okay.
will tell you exactly you need to use this one, don't use this other one.
Okay.
In fact, it's basically a general rule with provider, with Riverpod. Generally, there is only one solution to a problem, um, unless there is something controversial, like if you want to do mutable state or immutable state, then I'll offer the choice.
Yeah.
But generally, there is only one solution. Um, it's just a matter of knowing in which situation you are to know which solution you should use. Um, and so, for example, if we talk about not using conjuration, like if we go back to the plain syntax, a common question is which provider you need to use.
Absolutely. That was the question as well.
Yes. Uh, I know it's super common one. Do I need to use a future provider? Do I need to use a stream provider, a change notifier provider? It's very common, but um, the irony of this question is that, in my opinion, it's a bit backward. It's not which provider do you need to use? It's uh, uh, do what you want to do, and the provider that the provider necessary will naturally come for you. Like if you want to make a change notifier, then you will need change notifier provider. It's not do I want to make a change notifier provider and then I need to create a change notifier. It's the opposite way. It's I want to make a change notifier and therefore I will use change notifier provider. Do you see the logic?
Yeah.
Um, So basically, if you want to listen to Firebase, which exposes stream, then obviously you'll use stream provider. You wouldn't use something else. You wouldn't use generative provider to listen to a stream. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
You could try and convert this stream into a generative, but you get the point. So that's where code generation comes in. Um, basically, code generation, it's basically shifting the syntax to uh, change how people perceive the problem. Instead of having to know which type of provider you need to use, you just write your logic, and then the only obvious choice of provider, Riverbot will pick that for you because now Riverbot is able to determine which provider you need to use. So here we made a simple provider, uh, and Riverbot was able to determine that we need to use
Provider.
the provider, this one.
Yeah.
I wanted to use the other compilation, but
Very interesting. Yeah.
yeah, and so
If you had like a stream, like a return a stream string, then you would detect automatically a stream provider.
yeah, well, streams aren't supported by the territory yet, but yeah, and there will soon be. So yes, that's basically the idea. If you were to add the async keyword and return a future, uh, that would change the generated code to a future provider.
Future provider. Yeah.
If
Okay.
I go in here, you see now future provider. As you can see
That's
here.
interesting.
So it shifts the problem. Basically, you just write your logic, and then the type of provider works by itself. Like if you now want to make
Oh, that's very interesting. That means like code generation is actually getting rid of thinking behind what kind of provider you want to select. You just write your code in any way
yeah,
that you like.
exactly. I mean,
That's
in my opinion, it's always been this way. It's just the way people think about it isn't. Because the way they write the syntax uh, likely confuse some people. But I mean, the way I use Rootbot, I've never thought about which provider do I need to use. I just want to do something, and then the provider. There is just one choice.
interesting. Very nice to approach, let's say.
Yeah. So yeah, that's one of the things the code generation helps a lot here. It helps the mind quite a bit to focus on the actual problem at hand just instead of
I can imagine how many lines of code you're also getting rid of, in a normal way of writing provider. If we used code generation, you probably get rid of a lot of code. So imagine now you want to define a future provider or I don't know,
um
notifier, state notifier thingy, So
it's not necessarily the length of the code. It's mostly about because lengthwise it's basically around the same with a few lines of difference. It's mostly about how well it formats and how the utilities around it. Like if I were to add the provider again, hello world, provider, provider, hello world, because the ID. Um, like here, it looks confusing. Like you're defining a variable, and then with a functional, and depending on how long this thing is, can format weirdly. Or if you want to have a recursive provider, which can happen when you're using family, which is something we can talk about too.
Yeah.
Uh, like if you do something like here by combining a provider where a provider might depend on a slight variant of itself, like rest of watch, hello world provider with a, I don't know, 42. I like pattern 42. Here you suddenly have an error here because provider dark is getting confused because you have a recursive variable definition. Whereas if you did the same thing uh, in here with like if you want to use if you want to pass parameters to providers, you don't need to use family anymore, so you're not restricted to a single parameter. You can just take
Hmm.
whatever you want, like maybe a required name parameter with
I see.
ID, and then if you want to do a recursive uh, dependency here again, there is no problem anymore. Dark isn't confused. You can format things nicely. Like here, this is like a blind function, like formats nicely. Whereas if you wanted to do the turning comma here, the start might get weird. Um,
Interesting. That actually the second one, the latter one, it looks very natural as well. The way that
Yeah,
you write
exactly.
code.
The syntax is very natural. It's just a plain function with an annotation. There is nothing very fancy here. Whereas here, you're like, did I define some global state because I made a final keyword? What happened exactly? Whereas here, when you see this, you're like, yeah, I defined a function. That's all. Like, um, one of the other common question I see is this like global variables are bad? Why is robot not bad? And I believe part of the problem is like, because here you're defining a final variable, but it's more of
Yeah.
a syntax thing. You're not actually defining a final variable, you're more defining a function, and it's a weird function. Whereas if you're writing this, you just define a function. The problem doesn't really matter
Yeah.
anymore. When you see this code, nobody would say, "No, you made a global variable." No, you just made a function. Um, yes,
Interesting.
basically,
But speaking of that, Remy, a question here. So, in a real application, I mean, when you start working with an application, you I assume that you're probably not gonna write your Riverpod annotation here in the main file, right? You probably are you going to like keep all of the providers in one file or maybe different file, or you're gonna define it where it's needed, like in any file that is needed?
Um, I generally dislike the organization where people put all their providers in one place. I've seen people have a provider.dart file and put their providers in here. I don't like this at all. Um, the way I typically do things in ECS is I put things right next to where they are used. So if I have a provider that's very specific to just the home page, I put it next to the home page with it. So here it's in the main.dart, but maybe I could have a home.dart with my homepage with that like stateful code. And then I'd have my provider
Yeah,
next
that
to it.
makes sense.
Yes. Um, and maybe if you're separating the logic a bit, and maybe you want to extract just the home UI in one place, and maybe the home native here, you might have the home logic.dart, maybe
Yeah.
some class in here, home logic, and the provider with it, which returns your home logic. You get the idea.
Yeah.
We're things next to each other. So the core goal behind this is um, it's about making something intuitive when you search for something specific in your project. Because um, generally, when you ask yourself where is the logic for something, you don't know the type of that something. Like you you don't know if you want to know. Okay, what's where is the logic for the user authentication thing? You don't know if it's a class. You don't know if it's within a provider. You don't know if it's an enum or something. So when you look at your folder architecture and you see an enum.dart or class.dart or models.dart, you don't know which folder you should look into
Yeah.
because these file names don't really help you much. Whereas if you see user authentication.dart, then you will know you want this one instead of, I don't know, configuration.dart.
Yeah.
It's much more intuitive to look into.
Yeah. I agree. All right, sounds good. So then, well, I mean, so you made it so simple that now I had actually a bunch of questions regarding other providers where I see right now with Riverpod annotation, I don't really need to ask this question anymore because, well, I go ahead and write a feature and it will automatically detect that. So,
Yes. If
but
you want, we can talk. We can look into the problem the opposite way.
yeah,
What do you need to write generally instead of what provider? Um, Basically, the fundamental of Riverpod is that it's trying to make it's basically a way of writing logic that's very inspired from widgets.
yeah,
The basic idea is, with widgets, your UI is never out of date, unless you're maybe making a stateful widget and you forget to call set state. But that's an issue. That's more of an edge case. Because it's I'm going to talk about it later. Basically, if you're just writing a bunch of stateless widgets, your UI is never out of date. You can use team.off, whatever. Whenever the team updates, your UI will update natural.
yeah,
As opposed to if you were to use some more uh, legacy way of doing things, like if you were in web and you created a div somewhere, and then you had to do div dot text equal hello, and in the creation when you create the div, you need to also initialize it here. So you have two places where you modify the text, and you need to
yeah,
have in sync. Um, so we just solved a lot of problems here. But with state logic and stateful widget has the same issue. State is very what we call imperative, where you still have the same problem where you have an initial value and then on something like on pressed, you have some logic to update the state. So you have to rerun through the logic again. So you could have a bunch of errors here. It's probably a bit abstract because I'm not very clear, but um, anyway, maybe something clear would be basically with Riverpod, I'm trying to offer a different way of writing logic that is more. I mean, it's a fancy word, but more scalable in the sense that the potential for errors is much less. There are far fewer error possibles. Like a concrete example would be if you want to do a network request. Network request is a very common thing to do, and it's a very built-in thing in Riverpod. Basically, a network request in Riverpod is just uh, an async function. Like if I convert this to async, uh, by the way, that's one of the nice thing with the code generator syntax is you can just use convert tracing it. You now have a future provider.
that's nice.
um, so yeah, you make an async network request. So here you would do http.get whatever. Uh, you do your network request. You maybe decode the response like response dot from the user dot from JSON.
Yeah,
Well, you get the point. You make your network request here, and then in the UI, um, here, hello world. Let's go back to this again. the UI naturally have the necessary tools for you to handle things like error, loading states, like if with the hello world object, you don't just have the user or the string in this case. You have something called async value. If you look at this async value
Yeah,
string, an async value, I think like is loading, are there value, kind of like async snapshot in
I see. Yeah,
very similar to that, and it has a slight bonus point, which is the when function, which is a neat way of handling all the scenarios at once. So data loading and error, um, in a kind of like a switch case scenario. It's very similar to if you did if
yeah,
hello world loading uh, error. You get the point. Um, if you looked at the recent Flutter live stream, which announced pattern matching for Dart, this one function is basically pattern matching.
hmm
It's pattern matching without having pattern for matching for Dart. It's basically a slight workaround. And if you were to do it with pattern matching, you would do hello world async loading case, maybe async here. And here you do return text loading, things like those.
you're right.
Yes. So yeah, basically, when you make your AC and your network request in Riverpod, uh, with just this, you don't need to do anything for error handling or loading handling, for example. You don't need to do a try catch. You can let it throw. It's fine. Nothing will happen. Um,
That's good.
and your UI will gracefully handle things, even if you make a provider which depends on another provider. Like if I make another request here, and I want to combine both things. Like here, maybe that's the name, and you want to do full name. I can get the name equal dot future. Let's see try to run. So here I'm obtaining the name from the name provider, and then from here, I can maybe do hello name like this. Which is an async request, depending on another async request. I mean, I
Mhm.
technically could await something else, like maybe get last name.
Yeah,
And in here, we this when we try to read the name, if somehow obtaining the name failed, here is this await will fail too with the error that happened, and we voluntarily will let this throw again. Because then in this scenario, the error handling once again is, okay, the name failed, so obviously this should fail too. Um, so hello or this function will throw too, which is totally fine. And then when we try to read this new provider in the widget, then we can once again handle the errors in this case. There is never a case where the errors is kind of like a solid and you forgot to
hmm
handle it. You don't have bad surprises. Um, yeah, that's a thing. Or like if you
interesting.
wanted to continue on this topic, and now you made a network request and you want to do something like a pull to refresh, which is a very common pattern in mobile
Yeah,
applications. Um, making pull to refresh is natively supported by Riverpod. Like if you wanted to do a pull to refresh in Flutter, you would do refresh indicator, refresh progress indicator. I don't remember which one it is.
progress indicator.
Yes, progress indicator. And then I think it's just refresh indicator maybe with the unrefresh callback. Yes. So yeah, here you have your UI, which is generally a list view. Otherwise, you don't have something scrollable. So
Yeah,
list view, whatever. And so in here, you do your refresh. You see the application does it again for me. You can just go ref dot refresh your provider, and then if I do this in itself is enough, but generally the onRefresh function expects you to return the future, which completes when the refresh completes.
You're right.
And so you need to return something here. And so what you can do is just obtain the feature associated with the network request, um, and just return that. So by doing this, you refresh the hello world provider, which performs the network request, and then you obtain the feature associated with this request, and you return that. And so the refresh indicator will keep loading until the request is complete. And that's basically all the logic you need to do for your network for your update. You don't need once again to do any error handling again. Nothing at all. That's just it. Like your typical logic here um, of the one function during the refresh will correctly show the previous data by default. It's a thing C 2.0 version. During a refresh, the previous data keeps showing, or the previous error, if there is one, keeps showing instead of showing a loading state, because refresh indicator already comes with a loading state. There is this little spinner.
Yes.
So it would be weird to have two spinners on the screen at the same time. Um, so that's the default behavior. By default, your UI behaves naturally. It, yeah,
Interesting.
been rambling
So
for a while.
yeah, well, yeah, these are interesting. So one more question. I mean, let's say now you define um, two providers, and you want to use both of them. Let's say in one consumer widget. So first of all, consumer widget, as far as I know, it's not the only way that you can consume providers, right? So there are other ways too. So
I haven't mentioned it on purpose, but yes, you can. Um, Generally, is an alternative to this is consumer is nice. It basically will rebuild only the widget that is contained within the builder. But the slight downside of consumer is that it adds a bit of indentation to your build method. Um, like if you do consumer here to see better return consumer, like you see that it's slightly indented compared to just doing return text,
you're right.
like return text versus return text. It's minor, but and it's a few extra line. And so if you don't like these extra lines, there is an alternate solution, which is you change the base class of your widget to you basically takes your widget, which you would typically have. So here we have a stateful widget, and you just add consumer in front of it. And so here you do the stateful widget, so you have to do the same thing for the state, so consumer state. Well, obviously it's a correct state next to a big two. Yeah. And so by doing that, now within your consumer states, you now have access to the ref object, like with your consumer here. And you can do exactly the same thing here. So you can just do ref.watch here.
Okay, so in fact, if you want to do, let's say, something in initial state, then well, you can get an access to ref, and you can do that.
Man,
Let's say, or um, is that probably a good correct to say if you are dealing like with like let's say a couple of different providers in one widget. So instead of, I mean, the only disadvantage of using consumer widget is going to be the indented, things that you will receive. You can do that though, right? You can have, can I have like several consumer widget, or should I wrap them in the like a parent level of all widget, and then use, let's say, only one consumer per widget, or can I have multiple of them?
you can have as many consumer per widget as you want. I mean, to begin with, the consumer is a separate widget, so there is no issue here. Basically, if you look at the implementation of consumer, it's just a consumer widget which delegates its implementation to a function.
Yes.
It does nothing else. There's nothing fancy in here. Um, so you could use just consumer widget. In fact, that's generally what I do. It's just I tend to split my widgets slightly a bit more than your typical developer. I like to make a lot of small widgets. Um, like if I wanted to do just the text, I would likely just do like just this and take the my text here. Well, my text
Yeah.
consumer widget, and I have this here, and we'll
But
just grab it.
that's also one of my questions. Do you like to use consumer widget as um, the way that now you're using to extend, your main class, your main widget with that, or do you like to use the widget itself, the consumer?
Well, that's what I was about to cover. Like if I make small, because I like to make small widgets like this, which are very focused on one thing, and so at this point, the consumer widget, like the builder one, this one consumer with the ref here, it has very little value here.
Yeah,
Because you're basically even with this, even without it, you're still already rebuilding only the text thing. Because
I
since
see.
you're making small widgets, like when you use rev.watch, it rebuilds the widget associated with the ref. So here the ref is coming from my text, so only my text will update when the provider updates. So your scaffold won't rebuild when you do that and all. And so at this point, uh, the consumer thing basically does the same thing. In fact, you just added an extra widget for little value. And so at this point, the value of removing one level of an indentation and all comes in handy. And also, one thing I really like with this, but it's a bit advanced, is with consumer widgets, you can have a constructor.
Hmm.
And the benefit of constructor is when you split your logic in small bits like this, and where your state is coming from providers, you generally have no parameters at all in here. Um, and so if you have no parameters at all, your constructor becomes very powerful because you can almost always instantiate your widget with the const keyword, even
Yeah,
though the state actually can change over time. Um, which means that by doing this here, when you do const my text, say this widget did a ref.watch here, ref.watch all the provider, and and through whatever, and this provider updates, but the provider watched by my text doesn't. We don't want to update this text when this provider changes, right? We want to
hmm,
only update what matters. And since we're using the const constructor, Flutter will naturally detect that the widget instance didn't change, and therefore not rebuild the myText widget when this one updates.
yeah,
You basically get performance optimization by default without you having to do anything just through this const keyword,
yeah, yeah. Sounds good. Yeah, makes sense.
which you wouldn't get if you did the consumer thing because you can't do const here as you would use a function. And those sort of functions can be const.
Okay, that's interesting. So then, generally, um, breaking down to smaller widget with consumer widget, extending your widget with consumer widget is kind of like a best practice here in this case,
Yes, yes.
because we get constructor and all of the benefits that you mentioned.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, I guess that many people generally don't tend to do that. So that's why I mentioned consumer first, because this way at least they will update only what's necessary, and then they can look into consumer widget and all
Yeah.
if they want to. But yes, that's the best practice would be to just do a small widget like this, and you get It's basically the most efficient approach, while also fairly readable, in my opinion.
Yes, I
It's not,
agree with that, and probably maybe also easier to test. So you're dealing with only one piece of widget to test later.
yeah, probably, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so so far we this was great so far. Only one more question because we talked about it, but we never used it. So at least we want to hear your opinion. What, when, or what we're going to use hooks here in this
I
case?
knew it. Well, um, if hooks, Riverpod art is generally considered, is generally used for what we call global state, like your application state, like your user, your current user, things like those. Whereas hooks is more for local state, local widget state. So if you have a widget that's animating, there is generally an animation controller. If you have a form, you have some text editing controllers and all. And those aren't shared between widgets. They're just specific to one very specific widget.
Yeah.
So if you want state specific to one widget, you can use hooks. You could use a stateful widget, but you could use alternatively hooks. Um, and so one nice example is, say you want to make a text field, and you want a text editing controller here. You cannot do text editing controller here like that because your text editing controller would be recreated whenever the my
Yeah.
text update. So you would need hello, doesn't want to update. Oh, very confused by this. You would need to convert it to a stateful widget to then
Yes.
do controller uh texting yeah, in the controller. It's a bit tedious, and then you shouldn't forget to dispose it to.
Yeah.
Or it's fair harmless if you don't, but you probably should. Um, so yeah, bunch of logic here. And if I were to do the same thing with hooks instead, where you would subclass hook widget, or if you're using Riverpod, you can subclass hook consumer widget, which is basically the combination of consumer widget and hook
And
widget.
hook. Okay.
So it's basically both this and this. Anyway, yeah, hook consumer widget. If I use it, hook consumer, which is in the ref parameter. And so in here, we could use this exact same logic here. But instead of making a stateful widget, we could use what we call a hook. So hooks are typically functions which start with the keyword use. If there is no use keyword at the front of it, it's not a hook. And so those functions can only be used within the build function. And they're basically stateful function where when the build function re-executes, the state associated to this function is preserved.
Okay.
So here I'm using a hook from the, is it imported? No, it's not. It's imported. Shell hooks. So this is a hook from the flutter hook function from flutter hooks package, which basically takes the logic of doing all of this inside just this one liner. So it creates the controller and it disposes it. And when the widget rebuilds, you would reobtain the previous instance. You would create a new controller whenever this is update.
Hmm.
So basically, this is all strictly equivalent to doing this.
I see.
And the nice thing is with hooks, you can do two of them if you wanted to, and you would obtain two different controllers. So that would be equivalent of doing basically that. You can see how the logic is basically the number of lines could basically quickly exponentially increase if with it.
Yeah.
And even though here that's a fairly simple use case where we're just disposing something. Like if somehow now you wanted to listen to the changes on the text editing controller and update the UI whenever the text changes. One thing you could use is listenable builder. And you pass the listenable controller, because controller is a chain quantifier, which is a listenable. And then in here, we can pass the builder. And maybe child, I believe, yeah. Which then this function will update whenever the text field updates. Well, here we don't have a text field, so obviously it will never update, but you get the point. If I pass this controller to a text field, this widget would update when the text field is the text change. But I mean, we use the builder. The equivalent of doing this with hooks would be use listenable and you pass the controller. The use listenable is basically strictly equivalent to the listenable builder.
I see.
And so instead of doing return text, controller.text here, you can remove this here by just this line here. And the interesting side effect of this is hooks are just plain functions, which means you can make functions which use those functions. So you could make, you could combine. Say you need to use those two hooks very often together. You could make a separate function like text editing controller, use text editing controller, and listen. We could do,
Interesting. Yeah, of course.
yeah. You could call those and we can call those and we can controller, and then you use and listen, and you can reuse this multiple times if you wanted to. And then this would then listen to both controllers, and you could use both if you have a separate text. So you see, the logic is very reusable. You can make small utilities which you can share between widgets. If you make a separate widget, this separate widget can also use this new function. As opposed to if you did this here with a stateful widget, it's very difficult to share the logic of disposing those things. And if you made a listenable builder here, there is nothing you can really reuse between widgets. Whereas here you can very easily reuse this logic.
Yes. Now probably makes sense for many people why they need to use, hooks in this case.
It's a bit advanced, I won't deny it. And there are some rules around it. I would suggest looking at the README. You have to, for example, it's considered anti-pattern to do conditions around hooks for loops, like while. You only need to always invoke your hooks. You never should conditionally invoke them.
Yeah.
So it's a bit tricky. It's not very flourished to. So I get why some people wouldn't use them. But there's definitely some problems that they solve. So if you fancy, if you're interested by them, go ahead and use them. If you're not, then that's fine. I understand.
Very nice, Remy. Well, this was very interesting to me, watching you writing some Riverpod code. So I guess you don't really enjoy yourself writing Riverpod because you do that every day. But I think it was very interesting for me and then probably many of the viewers right now. So last question is okay. So if you want to say anything about Riverpod in general, anything that is upcoming or incoming, or generally, this is the last words that you may say to us right now.
But um, what was the last word? I guess I could if anyone is interested in helping, I would love some help on documentation and documentation primarily. Like um, I'm struggling a little bit with documentation, and I know that the documentation is a bit sometimes confusing to newcomers. I strongly believe that Riverpod is simple if you can understand if you're familiar with it. But many people tend to be scared by the documentation. So if you're motivated by it, um, reach out and try to help. I'd love to see what we can do together. And I'm even considering maybe giving some rewards to people who contribute, like maybe sending a shirt, I don't know, some stickers. Or we'll see. We can look into it together. Um, it would help me a lot, and it would help the community as a whole. So yeah.
Great. I mean, definitely. I will put the link to contribution guide as well as the repo to the description below, as well as all the Remy's, way that you can connect with him, Twitter and other repos. So please take a look at the repo and help Remy to write better documentation. I mean, in fact, maybe only not writing documentation, but also creating any type of content that may
Yeah,
make it easier for people to understand Riverpod.
yeah,
So that's also a type of contribution which I think Remy will appreciate.
yeah, for sure.
Um, that's very nice. And thank you very much, Remy, for joining this show. I think this was very interesting to me to hear from you how you would use Riverpod. And it will probably clarify a lot of things from other people too, right? When I use that, when I use this, and how should I combine, how should I dispose, and so on and so forth. That you clarified, at least from your point of view, and that was super interesting to hear. Thank you very much once more to
Just like
joining this session.